El Salvador, you know, is kind of notorious for its crime levels. They have a lot of gangs. Mostly they have two large gangs, which is the MS-13 and the MS-18. They started in Los Angeles by El Salvadorians, but they, you know, some of them, you know, got deported to El Salvador, and so that's where it kind of, I think, initially started. And so the gangs have a really big influence in El Salvador. Since knowing that, like when I was starting out, I was very, to tell you the truth, I was honestly excited. I wanted like to see how that worked. I mean, I think that was kind of naive and stupid of me, but I wanted just to see like just the different like gangs and how they kind of interacted. Like I thought that was kind of fascinating. And one thing about like in relation like to the gangs with like the missionaries, my entire time on my mission, I never felt like I was in danger. And I think the Lord had a really big hand, you know, in that. But that's one thing. And I think it's because even though the gangs can be very pervasive in a community, very perhaps threatening, they definitely respect the religious side of the community. And I think especially the missionaries, oftentimes we would have our uniform and we would be required to wear our, you know, white shirt and name tag everywhere. Even though we were doing some kind of maybe service activity or something like that, we would often wear that and then change into our clothes because it was kind of a protection for us. Because the gangs would see that, you know, they'd be like, oh, those are missionaries. They are coming around preaching the word of God. And so they wouldn't harm us or anything like that. And so that was one thing that I thought was kind of impressive. I mean, it's kind of ironic that a gang would want, you know, the help from God on their side, but that's just like how the culture is there. They always want God to help them out. They're very God-fearing people. And so that was one thing that was really interesting. I was most of the time oblivious to perhaps the dangers that might have been around me. And so that was something that was interesting to see, and the gangs themselves having their influence in whatever, you know, city that they were in. I remember one of my areas, they had the MS-13 and the MS-18 in the same city, but were divided by a road. And we actually went to work with one of the members that was there, and, you know, he, you know, dressed up with us, and he mentioned to us, he's like, you know, elders, normally I wouldn't be able to come to this area of town. And we were just, really, why not? And he mentioned to us, he's just because of the different gang, because he lived in the area of the other gang, he couldn't go into that. It was very dangerous for him to go into the opposite area. And I was like, well, do we need to go back? Are you in danger? And he says, no, because I'm with you guys dressed in, you know, a white shirt and a tie. And so that was something that was kind of eye-opening to me, that even though the youth, particularly I think the boys, were, they had to be very careful of where they went, just because of, you know, that. And I think they knew pretty well, the gang kind of established it very well of like how that played a part, but he had to be very careful as to where he could go. And so that was something that I didn't realize, and something that was very interesting to me. And I definitely saw that, you know, once he mentioned it to me, I saw that the people were very careful of where they could go, where they couldn't go. And so that was definitely interesting. Another thing was just how a lot of the people, in order to stay safe, oftentimes once the sun went down, they would go into their houses, which, you know, is very, you know, it's a smart thing to do. And so it made it a little difficult, but for us to, you know, be out there until 9 o'clock in the evening, we would often be out there, and there would be a few people out in the street, but most of the time everyone would be indoors, because that's when it would be safe. And for us as missionaries, we would just walk around. We would often find people at home. That's when we'd often have our appointments, would be in the evening, because that's when people would, of course, be home. And so, but it was interesting to see just the streets would be just empty, like very different from the daytime. And I think it was mostly due to, the violence. And even though if there was an area that really didn't have all that much violence, I think it was just a custom, like they'd been doing it for so long. It was just a custom that they had. And so that was also interesting to see, just that way to live. And it's not like they were living in fear. I wouldn't say that at all. They just had to be careful, just because it was just different circumstances. There is a police presence there, but I think ever since the El Salvador Civil War, the police presence has definitely, they've definitely mellowed out a lot on their police, just because of the gangs, since the police has backed off a little bit, and the gangs have as well. So it's just kind of like at this standstill, this peace treaty. And so the police would be there. I mean, I remember once they stopped me and asked me for my papers. It was just like a formality, they definitely did that, and they just usually patrol the towns. And so that was one interesting thing as well, just the police presence. I think it was there for just to let people know that, they're there. And so there's just that sense of security. So that was pretty much like what the gang influence is there. And we as missionaries were not allowed to speak to gang members. That's just one thing that they tell us not to do, just because it's, for obvious reasons, you can't really get involved. And I do remember one time we were speaking with someone. We found out that they were part of a gang, which I think is a common thing. And we didn't know it at the time, but when we were talking with him, he just started talking. He just said that he had been through a rough life and things like that. And we were speaking with him and his family, really a really decent person. I thought he was just very kind, and he was very respectful towards us, especially since we were missionaries. And so I guess that was one interesting thing would be to see. I think a lot of people are recruited into the gangs because they, don't necessarily have another choice. They kind of have to do it. And so that was another thing that was like really, really sad about that, was that a lot of the times they would be coerced into joining the gang. It was just kind of like a all or nothing deal would be to join those gangs. But overall, I think it was not as, I mean, if you do those things, particularly if the people of El Salvador would just follow those things, be careful of where to go, and not interfere with the gangs, I think, then they'd be fine. They'd go about their daily lives. I don't think it inhibited anyway their lives at all. So that's like basically what encompasses what my experience was of just the gangs in El Salvador. And even though they're there, and it's a reality there, I don't think it's something that needs to be all that worried about. The missionaries, like, we go everywhere and we have that protection, and so yeah.